Hey everybody, welcome to Freethought in Florida, a production of the Atheist community of Polk County, a Florida nonprofit organization. I'm Sarah Ray. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the Atheist community of Polk County. We are preparing for this year's Free Flow. That's the Freethought Florida Conference in Orlando in November. And we've been chatting with some of the speakers who are scheduled to appear at Free Flow. So joining me for this episode is Sarah Gillooly, Vice President for State Outreach and Engagement at Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. And prior to Americans United, they worked with the ACLU of North Carolina and Planned Parenthood, and they're a longtime advocate for a broad range of civil rights and liberties. Sarah, welcome to Freethought in Florida.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, I'm excited to finally get to chat with you. And I want to get into your career and activism and advocacy and free flow and all of that stuff in a minute. But why don't we start out first with just, tell us a little bit about who you are beyond these job titles and descriptions.
Yeah, well, I'm a native Floridian, so I'm excited to be home in my home state, in the Sunshine State. I grew up outside of Jacksonville, Florida, in Clay County in Orange Park, Florida. My father was career military, Navy. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. Some of my family is still there in Orange Park. So always excited to be home in the home state, although like many queer people who grew up in the South, going home is sometimes fraught for me, especially to Clay County and Orange Park, which is a particularly conservative part of the state of Florida, as I don't have to explain to you in Polk County. So yeah, I left home at 17 and have spent the years since in a wide-ranging career on civil rights and civil liberties and social justice work, and really cut my teeth as a young person on what it meant to be queer and genderqueer in the South. So that informs everything that I do now, even at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I live here outside of D.C. with my partner, Mary, and we rescue hospice Boston Terriers.
Uh-huh. That's sweet. Now we sort of were talking here before the show, growing up in a rural area, the town that I grew up in of, 1,400 people or however many it was. And then I moved to Polk County, and Polk County is a very rural sort of place too. And so, as a queer person, as an atheist, it's an interesting geographic place to be in America.
Yeah, I remember very clearly. I was about 10. I grew up Catholic, and interestingly, my mom likes to joke that they raised 5 Catholic children, and they ended up with a Baptist, a Methodist, an Episcopal, a Wiccan, and a non-theist Quaker, which is how I identify as a non-theist Quaker. So I grew up in a Catholic family, and I remember being 10 and challenging the family priest about transubstantiation. They were giving this lesson on transubstantiation, and I was like, well, so do you mean that this is literally, and I was really like challenging him, and he kept ending with saying, well, it's just a matter of faith. And I remember walking away from that conversation thinking, then I lack faith. And then as I got older and was clear about my sexual identity, was clear that I was also genderqueer, and I was presenting more and more masculine as a teenager, and started to really be challenged. My humanity was really challenged by the church in which I was raised as well, and a lot of commentary on my sexuality and my gender. And I remember sort of like this through line for me as a child of I lack faith, and in the eyes of this church, I lack humanity. And that was really formative for me as a young person.
Yeah, absolutely. And so professionally then, that sort of, you started out in community health and then got involved in, organizing and such around reproductive and LGBTQ rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
So was it growing up that you really sort of noticed, I'm interested to see how parallel we might be here. The issues between the LGBTQ rights in America and the separation of church and state issues. Um, that sort of came to me later. That wasn't something that I really clicked into right off. Has the church-state separation thing always been uh, an importance and a passion for you, or did that sort of grow out of the LGBTQ activism?
It did really grow out of LGBTQ activism, which for me really grew out of a sense of racial justice. One of the things I loved about growing up in the South was really being steeped in a history of resistance. Even before that word in the sort of Trump era became a word that we said, really, like growing up, elementary school field trips that were to Civil War sites and playing one of our high school sports rivals being Robert E. Lee High School or Banneker High School. Really, going to college and in Atlanta, which is where I went to school, and being at the MLK Center and really having a sense of what it means for a people to survive through resistance. So I think I came to LGBTQ equality and liberation work through being Southern, being white in the South, learning about histories of resistance in the South. And it wasn't until later that I drew that through line to separation of religion and government, or separation of church and state. And that's really what I do now at AU in the area of outreach and engagement. I think that there are the folks who come to separation of religion and government because of the civil religion issues, because of prayer in school, because of religious display. And then there are some folks who come to the issue through the ways that the lack of separation of religion and government, or the rise of Christian nationalism, is playing out today. Access to reproductive health care, to abortion and birth control, access to health care for trans people, access to fundamental rights in the workplace for LGBTQ people, sort of a range of issues that folks come to separation of religion and government. And my job is to help draw that connection to other justice movements now.
I love that. For me, it was, my wife and I started a personal podcast that's not anything to do with the atheist community. And initially it was, let's just talk about my transition and what's it like to go to this doctor and that therapist and take these pills and go to work and tell my HR, like, hey, this is going to happen. And then we started covering like LGBTQ news. And I'd been a non-believer for a long time. I sort of was an atheist for a long time, and then it just didn't matter. And then I didn't really become the angry atheist until I started, covering all these stories on the show about, oh, here's another example of, the Christian extreme dominionist right trying to, take away rights from my people, from me. And that's really when it was part of an awakening moment. And I want to talk about one of those stories that really got us into the sort of the news of it all was North Carolina. You were the director of political strategy and advocacy with the ACLU of North Carolina at the time, I believe, and at ground zero for all that House Bill 2 bathroom bill controversy stuff. Maybe for some of those who don't follow this stuff as closely as we all do, maybe give us a Reader's Digest version of that sort of whole mess.
Yeah, I joined the ACLU of North Carolina a few months after HB2 had become law. But what that was and what happened, the too long didn't read, was in less than 12 hours, the North Carolina legislature rammed through a bill with very little public debate and discussion that said two things. Number one, that no municipality in the state of North Carolina could pass protections for LGBTQ people at the municipal level. So no protections for employment or public accommodation. And the more controversial part, or the part that you read about more in the news, saying that people would be required to use the bathroom of the sex that they were assigned at birth. So obviously, the intent of that was about trans people, and forcing trans people to use the bathroom the government thinks that they should use, not the bathroom that they know is the one that's appropriate for them. So this became the bathroom bill and the subject of incredible political backlash. And I joined the ACLU a few months after that had happened, shortly after the ACLU had filed their lawsuit representing Joaquin Carcano and a range of other plaintiffs in that matter. And so I was there for this period in time where we were trying to undo HB2 in the public debate as well as in the law. What I found really interesting about that time was about bravery and also consequence. And the bravery piece is trans people are the most brave human beings on the planet. If you think about, you don't have to think about, what it means to get up and live your truth every day, despite incredible threats of violence, violence by the state, violence by religious extremists, violence by your neighbors. And that was one thing that was so present for me in that work, and seeing trans people come day after day to the Capitol to educate lawmakers, to speak truthfully and honestly and fiercely about their lives, despite the hateful rhetoric that was coming out of the General Assembly. And I also learned a lot about consequences, and this is sort of going to tie it back to separation of religion and government. At the time, I'm not going to call it a mistake, but we learned a consequence. There was a lot of rhetoric at the time about the economic implications. The legislature thought they had the political power to pass this law without consequence. And our community and other allies, trans people, queer people, and our allies really rose up and said, absolutely not. And there was like a boycott effort, and a lot of major companies, international and multinational companies, started to boycott North Carolina. Some states even prohibited state employees from traveling to North Carolina. There was a huge economic consequence for the state. And that created a tremendous amount of political pressure. But what it also did was it erased the humanity question. It erased the consequences to the humanity of queer and trans people in our state. And it became an economic narrative, and the economic narrative became the thing that was most important. And the way initially the legislature tried to, quote, solve the HB2 problem was by passing this incredibly complicated fix that didn't fix the problem for queer and trans people, but it fixed the problem for mega corporations. It made it very confusing, and corporations were just sort of like, well, that seems fine to us. We don't really know. The state wrote a narrative that said it's fixed, but it wasn't fixed for the bodies that were bearing the consequence. And it was because there was this consequence to telling only an economic story to the detriment of the human story. And the through line for me of separation of religion and government, again, is when we only talk about the Constitution and we don't talk about humanity, and we don't talk about people's lives, and we don't talk about the consequences of not separating religion and government, we do ourselves, I think, a real disservice.
Absolutely. And I think it makes me wonder, some of the messaging that we use when we talk about these issues, when these bills come up. Florida's been trying to pass the Equality Act or the local version of the Equality Act for forever. The competitive workforce and jobs, or whatever the hell it's called now. There's a couple different ones. That's the narrative, is that look at all these businesses that are behind it. All of these major, corporations that operate in the state of Florida, they want to support the rights of LGBTQ people because they understand that diverse workforce is best for their business and blah, blah, blah. And it seems like that does become sort of the heavy narrative that gets a lot of attention. And it makes me wonder if that's not, I don't know, you're a little more behind the scenes of the national movement, but it makes me wonder if that's not an intentional effort to sort of reach out to a more conservative, moderate, slight right lean folks that are maybe libertarian, who place a value on look, I don't care what you do with your life as long as the economy's good. I'm good. And we're sort of seeing a lot of that conversation happen right now with the administration that we have. Um, yeah, I wonder if that's intentional, um, and it doesn't seem to be as effective as one might think, I guess, is my observation there.
Yeah, sorry for the phone ringing in the background, and it is effective, and I'm, it's careful to sort of choose my words to not call that a mistake, but to call it a consequence. And I think it's just one to be aware of. I don't, we should make the arguments we need to make to advance policy, but we can't lose humanity in the efforts to do so. And I think that that's true for the work of humanist and secular and non-theist people in this country as well. Is how do we not lose our humanity in the fight, and then the arguments that we're making around the rights about the Constitution. Like, let's also tell the human stories of what does it mean to be a person who feels unwelcome in your own government. What does it mean to be a person who goes to school and be made to feel unwelcome because you don't share the faith of your teacher, of the prayers that are being offered by your coach, of the biblical scriptural quotes that are on the courthouse, of where place you're going to seek justice. Like those human stories that are not just about the Constitution says, but are also about what does it mean to make people feel unwelcome in a country where our value says religious freedom means all are welcome here, believers and non-believers, people of faith and people who don't prescribe to a particular faith. Like, I just want to make sure that it's like a both and, that we're talking about rights and economics, but we're also talking about our humanity.
Yeah, and I think when we saw a lot of what we saw in Texas, they followed shortly behind North Carolina. It's Texas Senate Bill 6, another bathroom bill, and there was a school district that we sort of connected with, some folks over there, and they seemed to tell that narrative better than I've seen done in a lot of places. And whether that's effective or not, it's important because, like you say, like we are lives, we are people who are existing in this reality with everyone else, and everyone deserves dignity and respect, and so yeah, to humanize it, that's great. And I think, and this is probably the wheelhouse of some of the stuff that you're doing. One of my passions lately has been in sort of on a local level, and this was a big impetus of why we started the atheist community of Polk County, is organizing those sort of cross-section, multiple segments together, right? So I thought for a while, maybe I'll, I toyed with the idea of starting up a trans group of some sort. And there, we had a couple of meetups, and it was kind of, not a whole lot of people showed up, and I thought, well, okay. And then it just kind of sat on the back burner. And then this idea came along, and I thought, well, I can probably do a whole lot more fighting for my LGBTQ community from within the atheist community than to just go create an LGBTQ thing. And so I think, a lot of our the conversations that we have with our people is, look, we need to build the alliances with LGBTQ groups and organizations. The American Atheists has a popularized saying, when equality is under attack, atheists show up. And we try to live by that as an affiliate of American Atheists, but also as people who value equality. And so then when we see religion affecting other things that may not directly impact the LGBTQ community, then we have those bridges already built and those connections are already made, that we can reach out to the network and say, hey, we need you this time. And that extends out to, women's rights and racial justice and all of these other groups of people who, in a common experience, are really fighting for the same thing, to be treated equally in a society. That if we can use that shared experience to come together and help each other lift everyone up, then I think that's something that that will win the day in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I love I read a quote recently about how political change comes when social change reaches a critical mass. And so, again, I don't work on the legal team at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I don't work on the policy team. I do field work. I am with our members and our supporters, really trying to create those conditions of social change, because political change follows social change often. And to the point that you're making, solidarity matters. Having a value matters. Here, we believe in a vision of religious freedom for all, the right to believe or not believe, according to your conscience. And separation of religion and government is a mechanism for that. It is fundamentally the thing that protects the value. But to be really clear on those values, I love the point that you were making about this value of equality. I've been really so admirable of the atheist and humanist movements having this conversation about what are we for, what are our values, what's the good without God phrase. I just think that that's so smart to really articulate not what we're against and what we're fighting against, but what's the world that we want. I think that that's how we win the day, is to create the social conditions that demand the political change.
And you look no further than marriage equality than to see how that actually works and plays out in real time, right? That's a recent enough example that we can look back at. Even in my old age, there were movements in this country that happened long before me, and it's history book stuff at this point. I didn't live through it, so it doesn't speak to me as strongly. But the marriage equality thing is something that we can look at and say, hey, that just happened. And that happened because the social conditions changed, which led to a slow swell of states enacting laws. And then once that gets to a breaking point, then it spills over onto national legislation. So
isn't that interesting how our opposition, how Christian nationalists and other Christian extremists, for a long time, like marriage was their assault. It was what they were fighting against, and they lost.
Yeah.
Right? Not that they're not still sort of picking on the edges, but their target was straight up marriage and simply challenging marriage. And the social conditions no longer allows them to do that. So now they're sort of like sneaky going around through this idea of opting out and religious exemptions and all these Trump regulations that are happening to sort of let people carve themselves out of various civil rights laws, because they lost when they were straight up fighting marriage, which is where they started, because the social conditions did not allow them to continue to fight that way.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, in that, when marriage equality became law of the land, and they sort of regrouped and went, well, okay, that didn't work. Maybe let's, let's go after trans people. That'll be the new thing, and we'll make sure trans people can't exist in public spaces and go to bathrooms and all of this stuff. And perhaps there was enough opposition to that that then they sort of regrouped again and went, all right, well, maybe we can pass this stuff in the South, but that's as far as it'll go. And then, to your point, this religious liberty stuff, I did a presentation in Orlando to the Central Florida Freethought community about a year ago on Project Blitz. And that's something that has been on my radar really sort of from the beginning. So when they started reporting on it, when the news broke that this was an organized, well-crafted messaging system with funding and a playbook and all of this stuff, the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. And so in looking at some of the stuff they wanted to do, it was just the most nefarious thing that I think had the dust blown off on it in a while. It was very specifically, look, we're going to do these little things that nobody cares about. In God we trust on the schools. Nobody's going to even bat an eye at that. That's the national motto. It's not a problem. We'll push that right through. And then once we start, doing these little things, then we'll move on to the things that, maybe make a little more difference. And the very last one is legitimately having like state governors get up and give a proclamation of, that this is marriage is between one man and one woman under God, and gender is a binary, unchangeable thing. That's still in the playbook, and I don't know, when that whole thing came out, it was shocking to see the level of detail and just what all they wanted to do. And I thought, God, how are we going to respond to this? And I don't know about you, but my observation was it took 2 or 3 years really for sort of the national groups to come together and really put together an organized opposition to this. Because it in part, I think, because it's a state level initiative that, I don't know. I'm glad to see that's finally happening. But what are you seeing out on the ground as far as the Project Blitz sort of bills and initiative? What are people saying about that?
Yeah, it's really one of the things that brought me to Americans United, like seeing the nakedness of the strategy in Project Blitz. And you were just describing that, like, whoa, this is insidious and smart and strategic. And Project Blitz is about creating the social conditions that allow for political change, right? Let's make all these small changes. No one's paying attention. They become common and acceptable. And then we go in and seal the deal with these like much broader implications. It has been really heartening to me to see more and more people in states across the nation see those bills come up in their state legislatures and respond. We saw a small downtick in those bills in state legislative sessions this last year. Obviously, we at AU are really interested to see what happens this next year in this next legislative session. I was impressed in Florida. You had a bill, a Project Blitz style bill, introduced by a Democrat in your state, right? This is not a partisan issue.
Oh, Kimberly Daniels, bless her heart.
And then you had a newly elected state representative speak up and stand out and really tell the story of the consequence of these seemingly innocuous bills. I thought Representative Escamani did just such a great job of being clear in her opposition to that. And 3 years ago, we didn't see clear opposition. We saw a lot of, there's more important things to worry about in this state right now. And I think Florida did such a beautiful job of saying, absolutely not. This matters. This is important. And let me tell you the story about why it does.
And given the makeup of our legislature, I'm really surprised that it didn't go very far. Kimberly Daniels is a Jacksonville Democrat who is well known for ripping pages out of the Project Blitz playbook to file onto the floor. She's responsible for filing the "In God We Trust" on our schools thing. There was one about religious freedom for students in schools that passed, and then yes, last year she tried to put through the Bible class in high schools, and that just didn't really go anywhere. And when we sort of saw this come up here, some of the local Central Florida leaders, there was a conversation about, sort of looking at the national landscape, and we have a Freethought caucus now on the national level. Is that something that we need to look at doing here at the state level? And who the hell would you even suggest for that? Obviously, Ana Escamani is one. Carlos Guillermo Smith is another. There's a third that spoke out against that particular bill too, and I just can't think of her name off the top of my head. And that's it. I'm out of names. So so much of it is making contact with. I mean, we look at our representatives here in Polk County, and they are all the not all, mostly the I'm going to post a cross image on my Facebook for Easter kind of people, like that's sort of what we've got to work with. And so yes, there's a ballot box solution that needs to happen, and that ties back into this organizing and getting people fired up about church-state separation stuff, even if it doesn't necessarily affect them and their community. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do. But I also think that's the pessimist in me. The optimist in me thinks that this is have we reached the final gasps of a dying breed? So much of it is tied into generation. And we're seeing younger and younger generations be less and less religious. And how's that going to change the landscape? I think all the time. I have a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I think having kids changed this in me. And I say this as often as I can. At some point, we have to get to a place where I'm not trying to make the world that I want to live in. I need to be helping my kids create the world that they want for themselves. And that means listening to people like Greta Thunberg. And, the kids, we look at kids and think, you don't have the life experience. What could you possibly know? They're smart and they know a whole lot more than we tend to think that they do. And so that's what I'm about. I'm about creating that world that they want. And God, we got to get them involved. And anyway, and get them running for office. That's, I guess, the other pitch there.
Yeah, I joke, I'm from the sort of I'm the end of a generation of the particular kind of LGBTQ person. And I often identify with the label non-binary. And it's not a label that I could have even imagined 20 years ago, and is a word that young people are leading the way.
Yeah.
They know exactly the world that they want to live in. And to be able to say, yes, I'm going to go there with you. I think the power of a story is incredibly valuable. And one of the things I hope to really impart when I'm in Florida and at Free Flow is whether when we tell our stories, it is about not only changing the person that we're speaking to, but also changing ourselves and making ourselves more and more able to live into the truth and the power of our own story. And so I think we often think about social changes. We need huge numbers and big rallies and on the steps of the building and massive change tomorrow. And we sometimes get lost in the bigness of problems and lost in the numbers that you need to make change. But all of those numbers come from small stories. The power of going out to coffee with a legislator with whom you disagree or with whom you agree and telling your story with deep compassion for yourself is valuable. It changes the person who hears your story. It changes you and your ability to live into the truth of that story. And so I think in this moment where we sometimes feel so just stuck and afraid of how hard things are to change, looking at the young people who are leading the climate change movement, looking at the young queer people or the young atheist people who are leading their movements, and being willing to share our stories with lawmakers and trust that long arc of justice, even though it bends towards justice, there's the long part.
Yeah.
It's still going to be long.
For sure. Well, and that's, I guess, one of my hopes for Free Flow is that we all come away with sort of this renewed sense of purpose and an intent to turn to action and get involved and have these conversations and build communities and do all the things that are the groundwork for the grassroots activism sort of stuff that it really takes to get this stuff done. So. So does that explain well enough the topic of your session, or do you want to go into any more detail?
I would just say that we at AU, we recently did some really exciting, a little bit of polling to sort of understand where our members and supporters and some everyday Americans are on questions of separation in religion and government. So I'll be sharing a little bit about what we learned, and really giving a sense of how do we in this moment of a Trump America, not just shout across the Great Divide, but really be educated on what's happening in the administration and then start to make steps towards those changes when it can feel so easy to feel small and lost and powerless in the vastness of the problem. So that's really what I'm going to be speaking to. I'm a non-theist seminarian, which is another little fun fact about my life. And so I'm really excited to be home in Florida and to have a sense of fellowship with the Freethought community in Florida and to share a little bit about my work and my perspective on the work.
I can't wait. Full-time activist and community organizer. You're living the dream. Oh, you're living my dream. I'd love to.
Every day.
I would love to quit my job and do something that actually makes a difference to the world and get paid for it. So look, maybe if you're a drinker, maybe I'll buy you a drink at Free Flow. We can talk about how one might get there. But otherwise, you're doing great work around church-state separation and advocating for minority voices beyond that. So I can't thank you enough for that.
Thank you for telling my story and your story and the story of others through your show. It matters.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, if folks want to learn more about Americans United and the work that you all do, where do we send them?
You can go to au.org.
All right. Sarah Gillooly with Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Can't wait to see you in a few weeks at Free Flow. And thanks for being part of the broadcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's wrap up this episode of Freethought in Florida. Join us at Free Flow, the Freethought Florida Conference, November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. At the Holiday Inn Orlando International Airport, Friday night at the Cocktails and Costumes Kickoff Party. We haven't decided what our costumes are going to be yet. I don't know. I'm not much of a costume person. I'm kind of whatever. So Becca will probably come up with something for us. Saturday night, we've got dinner with comedian Devin Siebold. He's hilarious. He's here from Polk County, and he's just a riot. And the Orlando Gay Chorus is performing. And then Saturday and Sunday, we have speakers and workshops throughout the day. And exhibitors set up. The Atheist community of Polk County will have a table. Come on by and say hi. We'd love to meet you. Go to freeflow.org right now and register, freeflo.org, to register for the Freethought Florida Conference. And as always, if you want to learn more about the Atheist community of Polk County, head on over to polkatheists.org. We post all of our events on Facebook and Meetup, so we'd love to see you at one of those. We have a monthly educational speaker series at the Lake Wales Library. Every other week, we go out and clean up our 2.2 miles of a roadway that we've adopted in Auburndale, and we do social events and get-togethers and all kinds of things. You don't have to be a member or an atheist to join us, and we'd love to see you out there. Remember, go to freeflow.org to register now, and we'll see you next time. Hey, what's up? I'm Sarah Ray with the Atheist community of Polk County. I'm stoked to be the MC for this year's Free Flow, the Freethought Florida Conference.
Orlando, November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. The whole weekend is going to be groovy.
I'll be rapping about separation of church and state.
I'll be talking about what might have made America great.
And I will be tripping. No, I will not be doing any tripping.
I'll be talking about the role of science in secular humanism.
Evolution education.
Community organizing and activism.
Transgender equality in America today.
Americans' attitudes toward, wait for it,
agnostics.
I'll be given the skinny on how summer camp can help build a secular community for kids.
Science education here in the Sunshine State.
Black feminism, free thought, and progressive politics.
You can get your groove on at the Friday Night Cocktail Party.
Friday Night Cocktails and Costumes Party, which kicks off the weekend.
We're going to lay down that funky music until we die.
Costumes are optional, but at least some disco will be mandatory.
I personally won't be there unless there's disco.
Join me and hundreds of other science enthusiasts,
atheists,
secular humanists,
heretics,
feminists,
skeptics,
non-believers,
Satanists,
and freaky freethinkers.
Tickets are at freeflow.org. That's freeflo.org.
So do me a solid and register today at freeflow.org.
Catch you on the flip side.
they should let me write these.